And joining us now is foreign correspondent Graeme Smith, the Globe and Mail's man in Afghanistan. Welcome home, I should start by saying.
Thanks so much.
You met face-to-face with prisoners who said that they were tortured after being handed over to Afghan authorities by Canadian soldiers. Tell us exactly what they told you happened to them.
A majority of the 30 people I interviewed told me that they had been mistreated physically, beaten, whipped, in some cases electrocuted. They were pretty awful stories.
Big difference between mistreatment and torture. You're convinced this was clear torture.
I saw their scars, and in some cases, some of them were definitely tortured by somebody.
Was this common or an exception?
As I say, it was a majority of the 30 people I spoke with. It's a small sample size, so it's hard to say, what percentage of people are mistreated in Afghan prisons, but it's clearly too many.
What kinds of things were they telling you?
One man told me a particularly gripping story of how he had cloth jammed between his teeth, and then he was bound to hand and feet and had bare electrical wires wrapped around his toes, and then electricity flowed through those wires, and he flopped around on the floor of the interrogation room like a fish, he said. There were all kinds of stories like that. People left outside in the sub-zero temperatures because although it's a very hot country, there are some months in winter where it gets very cold, especially at night.
Did they know who did this?
Yeah. Nearly all of them who described some mistreatment described mistreatment at the hands of the NDS, the secret police. But there were also some stories of mistreatment at the hands of the Afghan National Army, the soldiers. And some stories of mistreatment by the police, the ANP.
Any indication that you found in your reportage that suggested anybody in the Canadian forces knew about this?
It's not really clear how much they knew. There were allegations from some prisoners that suggested the Canadians should have known. But who knew and how much they knew, it's not really clear.
Well, why should they have known?
Because in one case, one prisoner told me that the Canadians dropped him off in police custody, and he was beaten fairly close by to where the Canadians were sleeping. And then the Canadians came in again later and suggested to the prisoner that he should be truthful with the Afghans, otherwise he would continue to be mistreated, that more bad things would happen to him.
Do you know who these guys are who are being mistreated / tortured?
Some of them were clearly Taliban. The stories they told me about who they were and where they came from and what tribes they came from and their explanation for why they were and the places where they were arrested suggested to me that they were insurgents. Some of them, in my opinion, were not Taliban. Both inside and outside the prison, I met people who were clearly innocent.
Wrong place, wrong time, that type of thing?
Yeah, and it's very easy to be in the wrong place at the wrong time in southern Afghanistan right now because it's all the wrong place and it's all the wrong time.
How did you find these people in the first place?
Two ways. I worked through tribal networks, contacting tribal elders, persuading them about why I needed to do this work and why it was useful to find these people. And they summoned their people. And in southern Afghanistan, this is the way you do a lot of things. You win over some tribal elders, and they cooperate, and they have huge influence, and they have huge sway over vast networks of people in the south.
Do you speak the language?
A little bit, but not very much.
So you have somebody who's negotiating for you?
Yeah, I have a couple of translators who work with me in Kandahar City. And I also went into the main prison, Sarposa prison on the west side of Kandahar.
I don't have to tell you what General Hillier said when he found out about your story. He wasn't all that thrilled. Surprise, surprise. In fact, he said the troops were, quote, pissed off that this story was distracting from their mission. Can you tell in your conversations with soldiers whether they feel distracted from their mission because of your reporting?
It's funny, I think Hillier sounded more pissed off than any of the soldiers I've spoken with. Because this is essentially a political issue. The soldiers are following orders, and by all accounts, they're following orders exquisitely well. And none of the soldiers I've spoken with were at all pissed off with me.
So your stories have not affected your relationship with the troops?
No, actually. It has affected my relationship with the Afghan authorities.
How so?
There was a lot of displeasure expressed by Asdul Khalid, the governor of Kandahar, and the head of the NDS, the secret police in Kandahar, which makes it more dangerous for me to operate in Kandahar City.
I can understand you wanting to be careful about how much detail you go into there, because I presume you want to go back, right?
I'm going back in 2 weeks.
You're going back. So I'm not going to push it too far on this, but they're obviously not happy with your reports. So why are you going back then? You are putting yourself in more jeopardy than you probably need to.
It's an important story, honestly. I mean, it's really important that what's happening in southern Afghanistan be documented. The people of Canada have to be able to decide how to conduct their foreign affairs in southern Afghanistan, and that decision has to be made on some factual basis. And at the moment, unfortunately, so little good journalism is happening in southern Afghanistan because it is so dangerous and it's so difficult to operate.
Have you got a visa to go back in?
Not yet. I'm hoping to get one in the next couple of weeks.
Would you be shocked if they didn't allow you to go back in?
I would be shocked, yeah, because Canada is doing a lot of good in southern Afghanistan, and so the Afghan government is usually pretty cooperative about helping the Canadians to do their work.
You got inside one of the prisons there, right?
Yeah.
What'd you see?
I saw a prison that was falling apart. Sarposa prison has a reputation for being relatively torture-free, but the conditions are pretty bad. The bits of the ceiling fall down on the prisoners while they sleep. There are snakes and insects that crawl out of the giant chinks in the wall and bite people in the night. The prisoners need a lot of help. And in fact, there's a new Canadian program that has promised to help them. The help hasn't really arrived yet, but there are now people from Corrections Canada who are going to that prison and assessing what they need and will hopefully deliver it.
Let's talk about Prime Minister Harper a bit. You saw he was back there the other day. In fact, they said it's, I think, the closest to the front lines that any Prime Minister in Canadian history has ever been. How do his visits play in Afghanistan?
Those kinds of visits actually play very well in Afghanistan. The Afghans respect bravery. And it would actually be fairly rare for an Afghan leader to go and visit the front lines like that. I mean, you can bet Hamid Karzai has never been climbing around to the mountains of Masumgar like that. Even the feared Taliban commander Mullah Dadullah, as hated as he was for his sadism, was in some ways respected for leading from the front.
So the Afghan population would appreciate seeing that?
Yeah, absolutely.
How about the Canadian troops?
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian troops right now, I think, feel as though for the first time in a long time, they have a lot of support from back home. They've got a sense of self-respect, I think, that they maybe didn't have 5 or 10 years ago.
You've heard this expression that a prime ministerial advisor's top job is to speak truth to power. Does General Hillier do that?
I don't know. I don't know what's said behind closed doors. I mean, it's impossible for you and I to know, I think.
Any quotes or sense that you would have from any of the guys that he's actually giving Prime Minister Harper the real deal on what's happening on the ground over there?
I think the real deal about what's happening on the ground often doesn't penetrate inside the wire. The Kandahar airfield as an institution doesn't absorb information very well. They do their very best, and there are some very smart, brave people who are trying to learn about the situation. But it is really hard for them to learn because it's impossible for a lot of them, with the exception of some clandestine workers, to put on a shalwar kameez, put on a local cap, and wander around in downtown Kandahar. It's impossible for a lot of them.
I would put on the list of smart, brave people a woman named Sarah Chase, who runs an NGO over there. Do you know Sarah?
Of course, yeah. I like Sarah a lot.
She was on this program not too long ago, and I asked her about the importance, plus or minus, of Canada's troops being over there. And I want to just play a little clip of what she had to say about that, okay? Michael, roll tape, please.
I could not stay in Kandahar if your troops were not present. And I have to just express to you my personal gratitude and the gratitude of the Afghans with whom I work for your presence and your sacrifice and your, psychological stress. And I know it's hard on families and things like that, but believe me, you are not doing an offensive mission against the Afghan public there. You are protecting the Afghan people against a really nefarious policy on the part of neighboring countries. And so it's two things. It's number one, the rest of us who are trying to rebuild the country wouldn't be able to stay there and do that work.
Now that's a pretty good review for Canada's troops over there, and you laughed in the middle of that comment. How come?
Well, I laughed at the phrase neighboring countries because she's so clearly referring to Pakistan, and I guess to some extent to Iran. You know, Sarah comes from a very particular perspective. She has a lot of friends in Kandahar city. And I'm starting to share that perspective because I'm starting to, you know, become friendly with some people in Kandahar. And the people I'm becoming friendly with are the NGO workers and the engineers and the educated class whose existence just would stop if the Taliban overran the city. And so the people who are protecting that city, the Canadians, start to take on a value, a very personal value for people like Sarah and me.
So Canadian troops are making a positive difference over there.
For these people who are increasingly becoming my friends. Now, there are all kinds of other people, especially in the rural areas, who see the Canadian troops very differently. And if you speak to someone like Kathy Gannon, who is the other guru of Afghanistan,
We've had her on too.
she has a very different perspective, right? I mean, unlike Sarah Chase, Kathy Gannon sees the foreign troops as being far less popular. And it is really impossible to know who is more accurate.
Is that your sense, though, that more Afghans than not would rather have the troops out?
I don't know. I mean, there has been some polling done that suggests that Afghans overwhelmingly support the foreign presence. But how accurate can a poll be in Afghanistan? I mean, can anyone really take the temperature? Clearly, there's an urban-rural split. The urban Afghans strongly support the foreign troops' presence. The rural Afghans are less supportive, but it's hard to know what the numbers are.
In our last few minutes here, let's focus a bit on one of the neighbors, Pakistan, because I think most observers believe that Afghanistan is never going to completely have its act together until Pakistan plays a more constructive role. What are relations like between those two countries today?
Increasingly strained. About 6 months ago, I was speaking with my editor, and I kind of predicted that we'd see some fighting between Afghanistan and Pakistan before the year was out, and it has happened recently. There's been border skirmishing.
Between whom and whom?
Afghan troops versus Pakistani troops, which is surprising. No, it's not good at all. And it's increasingly deteriorating. NATO is trying to hold it together, but there are some very, very serious issues. Pakistan needs Afghanistan to recognize the Durand Line as a legitimate international border. Afghanistan can't do that for domestic political reasons. It's a very messy relationship.
President Musharraf has suggested that it's time to negotiate with the Taliban, time to sit down at a bargaining table. The head of Pakistan says it. Jack Layton, for what it's worth, the head of the NDP in this country, says the same thing.
So does Hamid Karzai.
And Hamid Karzai. So, is it a good idea?
Yeah, of course it's a good idea, but the question is, who are you going to negotiate with? Because negotiating with the Taliban is a very difficult thing. It's a very amorphous organization. There's a sort of shifting panoply of leaders. You can't always get a hold of them very easily. Some are very, very extreme, and I don't think they would ever negotiate. And then there are other more moderate factions. So, of course, it's a good idea in theory, but putting it into practice is difficult.
Do you think there can be any peace in that country without the Taliban being a player?
I think the people who support the Taliban have to be brought on side. But whether or not that's possible, I don't know.
One of the other neighbors, Iran, has put more than $200 million into Afghanistan. What's behind that?
Iran has a very ambiguous role in Afghanistan, and I wrote a story recently suggesting that Iran might actually be supporting the insurgency. I didn't say that was definitely the case. I just laid out some hints and indications that suggested that might be true. And since then, the U.S. military has come out and said basically the same thing, that support is coming across the border from some factions in Iran, from somebody in Iran is supporting the Taliban. We don't know who, and we don't know exactly whether this is systematic or not. I tend to believe that it's not the policy of the Iranian government to support the Taliban, but something is happening there.
Let me ask you one more question. We got about 30 seconds left, and that's about Canadian troops. You know there's a big debate in this country happening right now as to whether or not Canada's troops ought to be there at all, or ought to be there till '09 or past '09. Having been there, do you have any thoughts on that?
I try to remain agnostic about these things as best I can as a reporter. I just try to document, what's happening on the ground. I can tell you, though, what would happen if the Canadians pulled out. I would be reporting on bloodshed on a much broader scale than is happening now. So I guess as a human being, I have to hope they'll stay.
Graeme Smith, we wish you well in your travels back to Afghanistan. Thanks so much.
Thanks.